Facebook is pushing ahead to take its digital currency project off the ground. Here to tell us what's on the table for Libra in 2020 is Dante Disparte. He's the Vice Chairman, Head of Policy and Communication over at Libra Association. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, and Happy New Year.
Well, as you said, we're in the new year. It's 2020. Is this the make or break year for Libra?
Well, it's certainly a milestone year for us. We've always set out a vision of being able to launch the project in 2020 ever since it was initially announced in June of last year. And so, of course, there's quite a lot of work yet to be done this calendar year. It involves continuing our engagement with policymakers and regulators around the world. It involves continuing to recruit additional members to the association, as well as ensuring that all aspects of the project are ready for launch.
Since the project announced, Libra has had to deal with questions on data privacy, questions on financial stability, concerns about money laundering. How do you think Libra can move ahead from this scrutiny?
Well, so needless to say, I think in part we welcome it, and we realize that a project of this type of nature and potential scope will require a lot of alignment with public interests. And so to that end, we really have welcomed the last 6 months. We've really treated the last 6 months in many respects as a consultation period. Ever since the initial white paper till now, we have learned a lot, we've heard a lot, and certainly have driven forward the conversation around appropriate regulatory approaches for these types of innovations. So we realize that there's a number of hurdles left to be overcome and crossed, but nevertheless, we're very committed to ensuring that we get it right from a regulatory and policy point of view.
You've just mentioned that you've really treated these last 6 months as a period of experimentation. So tell us, what are you trying to do differently that you have not done in the past 6 months?
Well, for one, there's the broad realization that I think it's important for your viewers to understand is, of course, the Libra Association is a new entity. It's founded, of course, initially with the white paper on June 18th, but we've been in a startup phase over the last 6 months. So there's quite a lot to do to ensure that this independent organization can exist and that at the same time we could reach the type of regulatory and licensing clarity that we seek. And so to that end, choosing Switzerland as a home, of course, ensures that we're not compromising on any of those standards as we move into 2020. So there's been quite a lot of effort over the last 6 months just to ensure that we're adequately set up and that we're adequately engaging with stakeholders around the world.
But can you be a little bit more specific? You've had these conversations with regulars time and time again. How can you get them on board, and what kind of conversation do you need to bring to the table to give them that kind of assurance?
Sure. Well, and I think the gap is actually narrowing, frankly. As you know, we've contributed to the G7 Working Group report on stablecoins last September. And that had started to identify a number of key issues that projects, not only like ours, but others in using stablecoin constructs or using blockchain to build payment networks, that there's a number of issues that we have to comply with, from anti-money laundering standards to financial intelligence and financial integrity issues. All of these issues we take very seriously, and they're very important. And so the association, along with the members of the project, continue to work very constructively. And as you can imagine, we appreciate that this is going to ultimately be a licensed effort. And to that end, we merely have to work through the licensing process with key regulators in Switzerland, but also key stakeholders around the world. So it's not a overnight process, as you can imagine, but that's really one of the most important priorities we have as a precondition for launching the Libra project itself, is to ensure that the regulatory alignment is in place.
So let's talk about Switzerland. Obviously, you have your home base here in Geneva. Do you have plans to shore up that, and what could such a presence look like?
Yeah, for sure. Switzerland as a home for the project, of course, as I said before, at one level ensures that we're very connected to an international bodies and international community that call Switzerland home. But at the other end, it also ensures that the project is really demonstrating a no compromise approach around financial regulation and financial soundness. And so to that end, calling Switzerland a home, which provides a lot of regulatory clarity today for a number of blockchain innovations, really demonstrates a commitment to ensuring that there's alignment on that posture, not only for Switzerland, but the EU and certainly around the world. And so you could expect over the course of 2020 that the association will continue to make necessary investments in Switzerland and for the project overall to continue that work.
Now, Dante, I want to bring you a quote actually from 2019 Swiss President Uli Maurer. And he actually said at a recent press conference, Switzerland cannot grant Libra a permit in its current form. What do you have to say to that?
Well, to that end, we've heard, of course, a lot of feedback, notwithstanding, the feedback that we've just heard, of course, from Mr. Maurer and others. We recognize that the current design construct of Libra is not meant to be dogmatic, right? That wherever their compromises are required in the project in order to ensure appropriate licensing and appropriate regulatory approaches, that feedback is part of what we've hoped to evoke and receive over the last 6 months. And so we now have an opportunity to take that on board and come back to regulators and key stakeholders with any potential design changes that will achieve the right standard. I mean, we've said it all along. Libra will not go live until such time as it can achieve harmony with the prevailing regulatory regime around the world. And so that's our goal.
So on that end, is it time to potentially reframe the Libra project?
Not necessarily, because if you think about the goals remain the same. And that is effectively to lower the cost and lower the friction that exists today in today's payment networks. Many of the payment networks around the world are like walled gardens. Imagine the value of an email system where you couldn't email outside of a particular email domain. It would lower the value. So it's really important to start building network effects around payment networks that would lower cost, increase access, and make payment networks more participatory for people. So in that respect, the goals remain the same. The design choices we may need to take on board to achieve those goals are part of what we're reflecting on and part of what we hope to work through as we continue the regulatory process and continue the pursuit of the appropriate license regime for this, which of course is to license the payment regime for Libra and to ensure that from start to finish, we're not sacrificing any protections around consumer issues and harmony with prevailing regulations.
At what point do you think Libra Association or Libra in general would be ready to apply for the payment system license here in Switzerland?
Indeed. So that's been part of the ongoing engagement. Of course, at the international level, the engagement with working groups like the G7 and others remains an important engagement priority. But we also have worked very closely with FINMA and other financial market regulators around the world to ensure that feedback is taken on board, and then that then is reflected in our operating plans and investment strategy for the project overall. So we would expect that over the balance of the first quarter of the year, we continue that work alongside the work of continuing to build the association and stick to the governance model that we had originally promised, which is one member, one vote, and really reflects a sort of long-term strategy for this project.
It really hasn't been the easiest 6 months in the last year, and some of the big names that have walked out or turned their backs away from the project have been MasterCard, Visa. I mean, what is the process now to choosing the next batch of members, and how can you convince these new entities to also stay on board?
Yeah, well, to that end, even if organizations have left the project at this phase, for whatever the motivation may have been, it's important to remember that the infrastructure the Libra Association is building is effectively an open standard, so that companies that may have left or others that have nothing to do with this sort of startup phase of the project will effectively be able to build and support payments supported by this open infrastructure. So that's an important design principle that we're adhering to as we continue to work on the project. On the other end, we do have a broad list of organizations, more than 1,500 from around the world, have expressed an interest in joining the project. They see some common cause with the vision of the association and trying to democratize access to basic payments to billions of people who are on the margins of today's networks. So there is still quite a high interest from organizations around the world. And as you know, one of the design principles for the Libra blockchain is to have 100 organizations a part of the association at launch. And so we still have quite a ways to go in vetting those next waves of members, which I would expect is the type of news we would be making in the first few months of 2020.
And are we still talking about a 2020 launch date at that?
So to that end, there are really three things that have to come together at once. The first and the most important is to ensure that there's a regulatory regime that governs this project that is very consistent with very high standards around consumer protection and operating expectations of a payment system at this scale. So that's really job one for 2020. In addition to that, we have to continue the work of building the association, building the membership of the association, and our approach to governance, which we think is quite unique. And then lastly, we have to ensure that the technology is ready. And that implies 100 organizations running nodes on the Libra blockchain, and that the sort of ability to develop open wallets and payment standards that are supported broadly is something that's ubiquitous and supports a lot of pro-competition environments around the world for these types of payment services. And so those three things have to come together simultaneously. We still think very much it's possible for this to be done in 2020, but you know, it's a long-term effort with a long horizon, and we'll stick to it as long as we can.
And Dante, just to finish up, there's a lot on the table in the next few months. I mean, will the launch be just a fraction of the initial vision that you guys had for Libra?
I don't think so. I think that the goal remains the same. And I think it is really important that we devote at once the energy and the time and the focus to not only what is the association doing, but why are we doing this in the first place? There are billions of people who are underserved by today's payment networks and many aspects of the financial system today. And we think there's better ways of supporting them. So while the association will not operate at the retail level, supporting households and consumers, of course, there's an open ecosystem and a lot of competition that can be generated around this infrastructure that is quite compelling. And I think to that end, it is still very much the vision to serve billions of people who are not currently served by today's payment innovations.